Stories and Figures of Israel, Original Sin and the Flood of Sins, Revelations of Jesus Christ from 1884 to 1950. The Story of Original Sin. Thus saith the Lord. The story of the first men that inhabited earth was passed from generation to generation until it was written down in the book of the first era. It is a living parable about those first beings that populated the earth. Their purity and innocence permitted them to feel the caress of Mother Nature. A warmth of friendship existed between all beings, and complete brotherhood between all creatures. In a divine parable, I inspired the first men to begin to have knowledge of their destiny, but the meaning of my revelations was poorly interpreted. When you were told of the tree of life, of the knowledge of good and evil, of which man ate, I only wished to make you understand that when man comes to have sufficient knowledge to distinguish between the just and unjust, and he began to be responsible for his acts, from that time he began to gather the fruits of his works. You know that God said to men, "Grow, multiply, and replenish the earth." That was the initial law that you were given, O people. Later, the Father would not ask men only to multiply, and that the species continue to grow, but rather that their sentiments are ever more elevated, and that their spirits begin a broad development and unfolding. Moreover, if the first law were that of the propagation of the human race, how can you conceive of the Father applying sanctions for obeying and fulfilling his mandate? People, is it possible that such a contradiction could exist in your God? Look at what material interpretation men gave to a parable that spoke only of the awakening of the spirit in man. Therefore, analyze my teaching, and do not say any more that you are paying the debt the first inhabitants acquired for disobedience to your Father. Have a more elevated idea of divine justice. This is the time in which you can understand me when I tell you, grow and multiply and replenish the universe with your good works and elevated thoughts. I welcome all who wish to come to me, to all who seek perfection. Free will and original sin. You say to me that, because of the freedom of will, you have fallen into faults and errors. I also say that through that gift, you can infinitely elevate yourselves beyond the point from which you departed in the beginning of your elevation. In addition to the freedom of will, I endowed each spirit with my light in its conscience, so that no one would be lost. But those who did not want to hear my voice, or did not want to penetrate into their innermost in search of the spiritual light, were quickly tempted by the countless beauties of the human existence. They lost the support of my law for their spirit, and they had to stumble and fall. Just one fault brought many painful consequences, and the fact is that imperfection does not harmonize with the divine love. Those who yielded, repented, returned immediately to the Father, and humbly asked him to cleanse and liberate them from their sins committed. The Father received with infinite love and charity. He comforted their spirit, he sent them to correct their faults, and strengthened them in their mission. Do not think that everyone returned meek and repentant after the first disobedience. No, many arrived filled with arrogance or hate. Others, with shame, realizing their guilt, tried to justify their faults before me, and far from purifying themselves through repentance and atonement, which is proof of humility, they chose to create for themselves a life of their own choosing, outside of the laws which my love dictates. Then my justice manifested itself, not to punish, but to correct them, not to destroy, but to preserve them eternally, providing them with an ample opportunity to perfect themselves. How many of those first sinners still have not rid themselves of their blemishes, because fall after fall they kept descending more and more into the depths of an abyss, from which only the practice of my law can save them. Noah's flood, the flood of sins. In the earliest times of humanity, there was innocence and simplicity in men. But as they multiplied, due to their evolution and their free will, their sins also continued to grow. And rather than their virtues, it was their frailty before my law that developed faster. It was then that I prepared Noah by communicating with him from spirit to spirit, because I established this type of communication with mankind when man first came to dwell on earth. I said to Noah, I will send a great flood to earth to purify the spirit of man of all his sins. Build an ark and take with you your children, their wives, your grandchildren, and a pair of each species of animal onto the ark. Noah was obedient to my command, and the cataclysm arrived in fulfillment of my word. The bad seed was pulled up by its roots, and the good seed conserved in my granaries, with which I formed a new humanity that bore within it the light of my justice, and knew how to comply with my law and live practicing good customs. Perhaps do you believe that those individuals who suffered painful deaths perished both physically and spiritually? Truly, I tell you, my children, they did not. Those spirits were saved by me, and they awoke before the judge of their own conscience. They then were prepared to return once again to the path of life in order to progress spiritually.